The National Investor's motto is, you can get information anywhere, but here you get knowledge. And for well over 40 years now, Chris Temple has imparted that knowledge, an unparalleled, understandable, and useful take on the big picture of the markets and of our world. He has been out in front of what you see on the news every day on many themes. More, Chris has taken this macro knowledge and his unique analytical abilities to uncover unique investment opportunities. Often he has guided his members to big winners in resources, biotech stocks, and more. His talents and connections often getting him into ground floor opportunities before they are discovered. Without further ado, here is Chris with today's topic.
Welcome in, folks. Chris Temple again with you, founder and editor and publisher of the National Investor. And today you're going to hear a great story of another outlier in resource exploration, that company being Fireweed Metals. Fireweed is listed both on the Toronto Exchange as well as the over-the-counter market here in the U.S., as you see on the screen. We were smart enough or lucky enough or whatever to get in closer to the beginning of this story, and so our folks at the National Investor are already riding some pretty nice gains. And indeed, Fireweed, for reasons you're going to see in spades today, has been one of the single best performing resource exploration juniors that I've known of anywhere covered by me or anybody else over the last few years, because of the startling projects it has up in the Yukon and the Northwest Territories. I mean, the most compelling world-class projects, pretty much, with both zinc and tungsten. Now, before I bring on the CEO of the company, Brandon Macdonald, who I've known for some time, he's a great guy, good friend, and all the rest, I want to go through a couple preliminaries. First of all, as you see here on the screen, Brandon and or myself might be making some forward-looking statements, so we want you to be aware of that. Secondly, National Investor Publishing, though we've had Fireweed as a recommendation for quite some time, the company doesn't pay for that. I give my recommendations to our paid members at the National Investor based on my best judgments. But as other companies do from time to time, they pay a fee to National Investor Publishing for some copywriting work, media, things like that, of which this video is a part. Moving on from that, one more thing before I get to the specifics of Fireweed story is that we're also going to have a profile of Fireweed Metals coming up in a commodities special issue of the National Investor I'm doing. You've heard me say before that if you want to know about markets and different themes and sectors and metals going forward, all you need to know is three words: supply, supply, and supply. And we're going to talk about how a lot of these metals are in very short supply going forward, especially when you look at critical metals and the fact that here in North America, generally in the US in particular, we remain very dependent on external sources for pretty much all of them that you hear about from me and that you're going to hear about today from Brandon. Now, Fireweed Metals has been part of the Discovery Group for a while. That's been a great boon for them. The Discovery Group's chairman, in fact, John Robbins, a founder, is the chairman also of Fireweed. And more recently, Fireweed has become a part of the Lundin network, one of the biggest names globally in mining. A couple other companies that we've had recommended are part of the Lundin family group, and the Lundin family is a major investor in Fireweed as well. As I mentioned a minute ago, Fireweed share price has been far and away better than the average among its peers recently. You're going to find out all of the reasons for that. So without further ado, I want to introduce to you Brandon Macdonald, who is the CEO of Fireweed Metals. Brandon, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Always. It's good to be here with you and to talk about a story that, as I said at the outset, has been one of the outliers in your space. You deserve a lot of congratulations. I've lost track of the number of Let's Go Brandons, that we throw at you on social media every time you introduce one of these assays. And folks, I'll tell you, of all the companies I've followed in several decades, I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of projects where, when you're looking at metals exploration of different kinds, you look at assay results, how rich the project is, and time after time after time, stuff that just blows your mind. Huge intercepts, high grades, long widths. I mean, that you've got a couple of monsters that you're sitting on. So let's go back to the beginning as far as the company itself is concerned. You're operating in a jurisdiction that is unfamiliar to the average person generally, and even people who have been investors in the resource space. We hear about British Columbia and its Golden Triangle. We hear about the state of Nevada. We hear about the Abitibi, etc. We hear about Mexico. Not as many people are familiar with one of the big up and coming jurisdictions, and one that has a lot of good tailwinds and public and political support, and that being the Yukon, and right next to it, the Northwest Territories. So whatever got Fireweed Metals and yourself involved in the Yukon, Brandon?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's been more a case of staying involved in Yukon. I was born there, lived there for, as a young kid, and in fact, lived in a little community right near our project. And I got my start in the industry staking claims with my dad as a teenager, doing soil samples. I got to admit, my first season, I was pretty useless, being a skinny little teenage boy. Um, but that developed a love of the industry in me, and I studied geology, and then so much work back up there, right?
Neat. Now you one of your presentations, and I had forgotten about this till I went back and looked at it, but I talked about the public support, the Yukon, which a lot of people hear about the Yukon when they watch the old cartoon Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer at Christmas time, and they hear about Yukon Cornelius, up there
Yeah.
prospecting and so forth. But the Yukon, actually, you're not terribly far from larger population centers, and that territory itself, through the Resource Gateway Fund and otherwise, has been doing a lot to bring better infrastructure closer to a lot of you up there. And you're, in any case, you're more in the southern part of that territory. You've got roads right up to your main project at McMillan Pass, don't you?
Yeah, and that's a critical thing. I think we think of places like Yukon, and the Americans would imagine Alaska, and it can be quite infrastructure challenged because there are wide open spaces where there is nothing, right? But Fireweed's quite fortunate that our two projects in Yukon are right on a road, and the government's committed a pretty substantial amount of money to improve that road. So that makes a big difference, because that is not only a big capital expense trying to put roads in, it can also represent a big permitting risk too.
Now, I have, in a few other contexts recently, in talking with other companies, there's a recurring theme for companies that end up being explorers. You do your exploration work, you do your drilling, you prove up a resource, and some of the more successful ones came about their projects because it was something that somebody else once upon a time was looking at, wasn't interested in pursuing for a while for various reasons, and dropped. Markets changed, zinc becomes more important, and boom, here you end up with McMillan Pass project. It was the genesis of that, and how you put together this land package in a few steps to now, and we're going to get into the details of this. You have a world-class high-grade zinc project.
Yeah, the initial sort of idea was conceived because of the shutdown of the Century mine and Lachine mine, a Century in Australia and Lachine in Ireland. These are two of the top 5 zinc mines globally, and both shutting down in 2015. So, by 2016, we'd had a handshake deal with Hudbay for the core of our project, but it was actually a series of land deals to assemble the entire district. So it took 4 years and 6 deals, I think, or 7, to assemble everything we wanted, right? And that really built around this thesis that what Hudbay had was very interesting, and they probably didn't quite, give it the love it needed, but that there was so much more there, right? And so that was really the genesis of Fireweed, and the evolution of Fireweed was like, but thinking bigger picture.
And that bigger picture, as it's evolved, the core is the boundary zone.
Yeah, well, that's certainly the new exciting bit, right? So we bought two deposits, Tom and Jason, off Hud Bay. Um, and Boundary was a discovery or kind of a rediscovery
Okay.
that was on ground we bought off Tech. Tech now is one of our cornerstone shareholders, the world's third largest zinc miner. But before they owned the 11 million shares or so they do now, they sold us part of the project for 1.5 million shares. And then the year after they sold it to us, we made a major discovery on it, right? So then they subsequently invested about $10 million into us to firm up their position, recognizing how special it was what we'd found. So that's, that's the evolution of the story that we had. We started with Tom and Jason, we grew them quite a bit. We added Boundary Zone, which is, as you mentioned in your intro, delivering, I mean, the best zinc drill results any project gets globally. So it's pretty special. And then there's all these hints of other zones across the project suggesting we may have more of these as well.
Well, and as you just finished up that comment, I had one of your slides on the screen showing how all of these different parts of McMillan Pass, where they line up. You've still got way to the west a large area that's largely untested that you think things could extend there. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Brandon, but Boundary Main and Boundary West, you believe those may connect as well?
Well, I mean, it's not a matter of belief, we know now because
Okay.
the end of 2022 season, we kind of theorized that was possible. And the 2023, drill season, first holes was attempt to connect those two, subzones and realize they were connected. So
Okay.
now we don't refer to Boundary West and Main. We just say boundary, right?
Boundary overall. That's
Yeah.
wow. And then more recently, you just had a discovery hole quite a ways away from the main part of the Tom deposit, and that seems to be expanding that potential.
Yeah. And well, the amazing thing about the Tom deposit is that was first drilled in 1951 with the discovery of the Tom West zone. And the Tom East zone was not found until, I mean, is literally 200 meters away from Tom West. It outcrops even, I mean, like just a tiny bit, right? But that wasn't found till 20 years later. And another 20 years after that, the first hints of Tom South, as we call it, were found. But it really took us to chase it last year and validate the historic results and find that, yeah, there was likely a zone of very high significance there that had never been drilled before. So it's extremely exciting. And I kind of said that I think this is the most meaningful addition to Tom in decades. And I think that probably the most meaningful addition to the project since the sort of 2020 discovery of the massive sulfides at Boundary.
Right. So overall, if we back up a step or two, the last official resource estimate you had for that was in 2018 and around 50
Mm.
million tons, was it
Yeah, 11 million tons
altogether?
indicated, 39.5 million tons inferred. Yeah.
Right. And you're looking sometime by about mid-year at updating that based on some of the drilling since then.
Yeah, so we've had 6 seasons of drilling since that 2018 resource. And we would expect to publish a new resource in Q2 this year. I'm not going to be any more specific than that because
Right.
I just don't know. We're not far off along for specific guidance, but I feel pretty comfortable about Q2.
That'd be good. Now, and I would suspect that that's going to sizably improve on what you had before. I'll just throw that out there. I mean, it stands to reason with all
Oh
the
yeah,
drilling you've done.
I mean I've guided as much, right? The old resource included only Tom and Jason. The new one will be Tom, Jason, Boundary, as well as a smaller zone called End Zone. I think I don't know exactly what it's going to come in at yet. I'm not playing coy to protect inside information. I just don't know, but I think it's going to be plus or minus a double-ish in tonnage.
That'd be neat. That'll get people's attention even beyond what we've already seen. Now let's back up one more step though, Brandon. You mentioned a few minutes ago how zinc has become a more compelling story among metals, maybe not followed as widely as people follow gold or uranium or something like that, but two
Yeah.
major zinc projects shutting down in recent years. Beyond that, zinc has been classified as a critical metal. There is precious little of it that is being produced in our part of the world. Tell us a bit about what people should understand about why they need to pay attention to zinc.
Yeah, I think you can make the broad case for all base metals in terms of the story of underinvestment, right? But I think what's unique about zinc, and you talked about this earlier, is supply, 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 right? Like um, copper, I think, has a unique demand sort of story to be told. But in contrast, zinc to copper, in copper, you look at the top 15 mines, and 14 out of the 15 have mine lives greater than 10 years ahead of them, right? Whereas zinc, 10 of the top 15 are due to shut down in the next 10 years. Now, some will manage brownfield expansions. There's a few new ones coming online. I mean, Ozernoye in Russia, although they had a big fire in their plant that's going to delay that, and Kapushi and DRC. But there's a very, very dire situation in zinc, and there's not a lot of credible development assets of scale out there. And this is why we feel like we're in such a good position. If within the next 10 years we want to replace 10 of those 15 mines, even 5 of those 15, there needs to be a lot more projects like ours found.
And on a global scale, you've put some information out about how this would compare, and you're really one of the top resources potentially in the world, especially with the grades that you've got. And also by way of comparison, there was an acquisition several years ago, actually in Arizona, with a big zinc project where South 32 bought a company out. And how would you stack up? What was the resource base of that one when it was bought for over $2 billion?
So that was just under 3 times in terms of tonnage of what our 2018 resource was, slightly lower grade. So they're slightly less than 3 times contained metal. And I would note entirely underground, right? So whereas we imagine that, as to total hazard of guess, it's going to be 30 to 50% of our tons, maybe more, will be open pit.
Right.
So that this is going to make a material difference in our capacity for high throughput, low costs, et cetera. So I think that's, one of the things I've been pounding the table is everyone thinks zinc is kind of boring, but Arizona mining was still a bigger takeout than Great Bear. As exciting as Great Bear was, Arizona mining was bigger. So there's these base metal projects. When the market gets hot and the supply gets squeezed, and these majors are desperate for a project, they transact at big dollars.
Oh, that's for sure. And when you put out your new resource estimate, you'll do a fair bit of catching up to what that resource is down there. And I think that'll make it even that much more stark how cheap you guys are right now in the market. Even after you've had a halfway decent share price performance, it's still, as I see things, dirt cheap. You more recently you added Project Mactung, which adds a second major critical metal and critical metal story to the list, that being tungsten. Mactung is adjacent to the northeast, is it? We see on the map here. Okay. And that's a project that you acquired more recently than McMillan. Tell us about how you came about that.
Yeah, that was a project that had sat with the government for about 7 years. The previous owner before them had gone bankrupt owing to the failure of a different project, a mine southeast of, well southeast of us. Mactung was their crown jewel. This was going to be the greatest tungsten mine in the world. They had taken it through feasibility, taken it through the environmental assessment, and they went under due to low, tungsten prices. And I have it on pretty good authority, those low tungsten prices were a deliberate attempt by China, a successful attempt to shake out Western production. Fast forward to now, 2023, 2024, and finally the West is recognizing that maybe being entirely reliant on China for certain metals, tungsten, rare earths, graphite, etc., is not such a good idea. I don't think it's bad to be a trading partner with them, right? I think you could say, let's get half our tungsten from China. I don't think it's such a bad deal that you and I go down to Home Depot, buy a tungsten carbide drill bit for our power drill, and it's made in China. I don't think it's a big deal, right? But when you're talking about, the sort of military and aerospace and high technology applications, you need a secure Western supply. So, we managed to convince the government to sell us that in 2022, closed the transaction in 2023, and, published a resource last year as well, and confirming that this is if not the best tungsten deposit in the world, certainly the best outside of China. Big enough in terms of contained metal that it could supply everything that North America needs for 40 or 50 years. And that's, there's no North American tungsten mines now, right? So we're entirely reliant on imports.
Wow. Just like with so many things here in the U.S., we're reliant entirely. All that's starting to change in a couple of baby steps on uranium. You mentioned rare earth elements, and especially the processing and refining of rare earths. It has not been a good. I remind people all the time, is till I'm blue in the face, that where the U.S. is concerned, it wasn't just electronics and sneakers and T-shirts that we decided to have made overseas. It's been pretty darn near everything, and we're starting to get a major wake-up calls for this. And I think it's a cool story, Brandon, because as I said earlier, successful companies in the exploration space are ones that are able to find projects that somebody else gave up, somebody else in this case failed on, and you were able to come in and scoop this thing up. And again, it's mind-boggling when you look at some of the results that you've had there. This thing, you've got a timeline, I think, to where within not too many years, this thing could actually be in production.
Yeah, we're thinking, you could start construction, possibly under 4 years from now, right?
Wow.
So, we're pretty heavily engaged with the governments to try to make this happen. And I think it's a reflection of being opportunistic and being a bit contrarian, right? Because, if you wait until the market is desperate, I mean, it is desperate for tungsten now, but until they finally figure out how to properly price ex-China metal, like there needs to be a price premium if you don't want to rely on China, and they're producing at a loss a lot of their mines, right? So this is not a true price discovery process. So if you want Western production, there has to be a premium for that. That premium is going to emerge, and suddenly every boy and their dog is going to want a graphite or rare earth or tungsten project, and all these projects that look like they had marginal economics before are suddenly going to look like, superstars. And so really the move that Fireweed made was like, well, we saw this coming. The acquisition price was so low that it was a low cost bet. But the potential return was massive. So it's an interesting project that we spend as much of our mental effort on it, in government relations, as we do on sort of geology.
Yeah, that's neat. Talking about low cost acquisitions, you also recently added a third project, which is more greenfield. It's to the north of these two, Gaina. That was basically for the cost of staking. You were able to come up with some information about some past exploration work by others, but this is another zinc project. And I should point out as well, and we've had a couple of these things on the screen, but you've got decent amounts of lead and silver, especially at McMillan Pass as well. But up at Gaina, which adds a little bit more blue sky potential for down the road, you've got zinc, lead, silver, and some other interesting components to that.
Yeah, well, it's a super interesting exploration story because of the geological comparison is Kipushi, which I mentioned earlier in terms of big zinc mines coming online right now. And that's, the core of Kipushi is what they call the big zinc. And that's a 11 million ton zone that I think is 34% zinc, which is bananas. So to have two very credible geoscientists, one, the chief geologist for Ivanhoe, who owns Kipushi, write a paper and say there's only two places in the world where this, you see this geology. One is Kipushi in DRC, the other is Gaina in Northwest Territories, was extremely interesting to us. And the ground was open, right? So $40,000 later, we own it. No underlying royalties, no vendor agreements, no work requirements. And that's opportunistic, right? And you have to balance opportunism with understanding your own bandwidth and understanding your capacity to raise money, right? But when the holding cost is basically nil, We'd like to drill Gaina. It could possibly be this year, but if it's not, like, we're not spending $1 million a year to maintain it, right? It would be not maybe nothing, right? So this is something that as a CEO and management team of a company, you gotta always you have your strategy and you pursue the strategy and you work towards that. And then if little opportunities come up or big opportunities come up, you pivot and you pivot quick, and with the right amount of due diligence that goes in it, right? So I think that's always going to be how Fireweed operates. There's no guarantee we do any more interesting moves like this, but it's entirely possible we might, because we remain opportunistic and nimble.
Well, and again, back to what we talked about a few minutes ago, there are projects everywhere that have never been touched, that were touched years ago and nobody wants them. We know that these days, this has been a story as far as base metals generally, that though it should be getting far, far more attention, and not just in the markets, but in the broader media and even in the broader political discussion, it gets precious little. Where we have as societies really no idea where a lot of our materials are coming from 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now that we're going to need. And all of a sudden, one by one, the light bulbs are going off. And what I think we're going to see, folks, where fireweed is concerned, and I think the tungsten story is a great one. The zinc story is a great one. But I've said this time and again recently, even in regard to other metals like copper, that you're going to see happen one by one what happened with uranium in about the last 2 years, where all of a sudden the story is so compelling and a light bulb starts to go off over people's heads and say, holy cow, we don't have the uranium that we need to fire reactors. And look at what, you know this, Brandon. I mean, the uranium price has gone up fivefold from its
Yeah.
low just a couple of years ago. And we may not get those kind of percentage gains, but we're going to see, I think, again, one after the other, these base metals, these critical metals, we're going to start seeing them move. And a lot of them are going to have the same kind of rip your face off rallies, I think, going down the road that uranium has. So looking toward the balance of this year and maybe a little bit beyond, Gaina is something that you said you may do some drilling there this year, but I'm sure it's not the top priority, because the top priority is to get Macdonald and McMillan Pass furthered. You're going to increase the resource at McMillan Pass. And so give us just a Cliff Notes version of what your plans are for the year for both of those major projects, especially.
Yeah, the good news about Mactung is when we inherited it, it was drilled to a mostly indicated status, which, that the higher level of confidence in the resource. So there's very little to no drilling needed to proceed to a pre-feasibility study or a feasibility study. That means the advancement up until construction decision is relatively inexpensive. It doesn't make it cheap, but it's relatively inexpensive. Contrast that to Mac Pass, where we have what I would consider a Hollywood problem of it keeps growing. And every time it grows, that means there's more drilling to do to drill it to those higher levels of confidence, right? I will keep, graciously accepting this problem the longer the geology gives it to me, because I think it's a fantastic problem to have. Like, oh no, it keeps getting bigger, right? Like, I'm not losing any sleep over this. But that one, most of our drilling this coming year is going to be still continued resource expansion. We're going to engage in some limited infill, and really the infill will be focused on, because we have this new resource that's coming out before the drill season. So we want to look at that and understand what are parts of the resource that are economically important and uncertain. And those are the parts that you want to start infilling, right? Parts that are high certainty or low economic importance, there's no point doing the infill now, right? So, we'll do a little bit of that, but we're also going to do quite a bit of regional exploration as well. Some of that blue sky potential we talked about earlier. We'll be chasing some of that. So it's going to be a pretty busy season for us. We're glad that we put in a new camp last year, so we have expanded capacity. Should be nice, smooth operations for us this year.
Nice. And ultimately, of course, whether it's some of your present large investors or others, you're looking to build this thing up to the point where someone with the kind of expertise and pockets to actually develop this thing in the end, where they say, okay, this has been a great problem that you've had, and now we want that problem because this thing is big enough, the scale is great enough, the grade is great enough, and so forth. So that's pretty much the ultimate objective, right?
Yeah, I think, M&A tends to be the result of a good strategy rather than a strategy in and of itself, right? So we
Right.
are growing, de-risking, advancing. We'll take it through assessment, and if the right offer comes along, and I have pretty firm opinions about what the right offer is, and it's many multiples beyond what we're at now.
Yeah.
Then there's a discussion to be had. If they're not willing to pay up, then we'll build it, and we'll own one of the best zinc mines globally, right?
Yeah.
That's not a bad situation to be in.
Certainly isn't, and not to have one of the best, if not the best in our hemisphere, at least tungsten mine as well. So you got two major potential cash machines down the road that are of critical metals that people need. Before we close, Brandon, tell us a little bit about how you work with the local community there. You've, of course, like most Canadian projects in your part of the world, you're on First Nations territory and you work with those people. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that's a thing that is increasingly important. I think our industry had been colloquially cowboys before, right? And um, ran pretty roughshod over local communities, and the new dynamic in terms of both legal framework and social framework and investing framework for that matter, the requirements have changed, right? And that's something we always took seriously. The most affected communities by our project is a community I grew up in, right? So I still have strong ties there. We have a good relationship with the community. So, I think it's about half our work on the project goes through Indigenous owned businesses or Indigenous partnered businesses with the largest employer in that community. These are the steps you take. You build capacity, you engage in training. Whether you're cynical about it or whether you're doing it for some feeling of moral necessity, you have to do it. I had a meeting in Japan with one of the big corporates there, and this was ages ago. It was our first introduction to them. And they said, tell me how the road's going and tell me how your relationships are with the First Nations. They didn't want to talk geology. This is like, your geology is great. Tell us those things, right? So this is like, there's a big stick there if you screw it up, but there's also a big carrot if you do it right. These critical mineral funds that are emerging and investing in companies like ours, almost all have ESG boxes to check as well, right? So you want the most capital available to you because it lowers your cost of capital. So these things really can barely be considered a cost center when you consider their impact on your cost of capital, right? So we're happy to keep doing them.
That's great. And I follow these things. I have to, of course, so that I'm more conversant about stories like yours and others. I was recently on a webinar that Benchmark Mineral Intelligence did, starting with lithium. They are coming up with pricing models for eventually all the major materials and metals in the world. And a very big part of this is going to be a sustainability / ESG score. And there's going to be impediments to end users down the road if these people have their way, buying metals from bad actors, from ones that don't have good social and ESG scores. So, and as you pointed out, it's about time for this. And happily, in your part of the world, and I followed the one of the First Nations bands in this guy in northern BC, they're starting a royalty company with
Yeah.
a couple of companies that operate on their ground because they see the future, and now they know they've got skin in the game. They're not being run roughshod over, but they're partners, and that's the way it should be. And I'm glad that you guys are well advanced in that area as well. So Brandon, I every time I see fireweed when I go to my Twitter feed, I say, oh boy, what are today's numbers going to be? Because this has been just an absolute blast to watch, double-digit assays time and again on zinc. And again, folks, very few projects in the world you're going to see this big with these kind of numbers. And look, if you'd have bought Fireweed several years ago and it all started, you'd have got it a little bit cheaper, but this is still the beginning. in my opinion, and as well as you guys have done, and certainly compared to your peers, as well as you've been rewarded in the markets in relative terms, that's nothing in my view, compared to what's to come. So congratulations again, Brandon, for overseeing these two really world-class projects with zinc and tungsten, and the lead and silver and whatnot to go along with them. And folks, I can't stress enough, spend some time at Fireweed's website. It's here on the screen again. Contact the company, get on their mailing list, follow them as I do on social media to keep up with the news, kick the tires, so to speak. And don't forget again that they're also going to have a profile in my upcoming commodities and metals issue of the National Investor. And if you don't have access already to that by being on my mailing list, make sure you sign up right away so that you don't miss that. So Brandon, again, great job. And I'm looking forward to the resource estimates and other news to come. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
You bet.
For much more of the National Investor's cutting-edge content and actionable investment opportunities, make sure to subscribe to Chris's free content at nationalinvestor.com. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel too. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.